Hello, my name is Jelissa Caldwell. I am a museum educator at the Museum of the City of New York, and in my own personal scholarly work, I also focus on the history of gender sexuality, New York City history, and the legacies of slavery in New York. And I am so honored to be joined today by Dr. Christopher Paul Harris. Chris is a postdoctoral fellow in African American Studies at Northwestern University and an incoming assistant professor of Global Black Studies in the Department of Global and International Studies at the University of California, Irvine. He is also a former pre-doctoral fellow here at the Museum of the City of New York, during which he co-curated a dedicated section on the movement for Black lives in the museum's permanent exhibition, Activism New York, along with the attached educational programming for it. His first book, To Build a Black Future, Blackness and Social Movement in the Time of #Black Lives Matter, is forthcoming from Princeton University Press. And thank you so much for being here with me today, Chris.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be in conversation with you.
You know, me personally, I'm also a believer in trying to understand our present, that we have to go all the way to the past and think of the historical roots when we're thinking about fighting for racial equality and in our current Black activism today. So I'm curious if you can help us define the terms of abolition and emancipation in the context of slavery in the United States.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important question also in terms of not just thinking about that time period, but also contextualizing some of the activism that's been going on recently. So I'm really excited to think about that question with you. I think there are 4 steps to it, actually. The first step is what I think most people generally think about when they think about slavery and emancipation. So it's in its strictest sense, which is abolition is the formal ending of slavery in the United States, and emancipation is the moment when those slaves are free, right? So in the strictest sense, that's what it is. And most people would generally attribute those moments to a couple of different dates. The first date would be Lincoln's famous Emancipation Proclamation, which he first issued in September of 1862, and it became official in January of the next year. So that's the first step. But slavery wasn't officially abolished until the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, right? So these are the 2 benchmark moments. But as you know, in your scholarship and from working in the museum, the process of abolition and emancipation had been taking place for years prior to that. So from 1780, when the first law in Pennsylvania, I think, was on the books semi-abolishing aspects of slavery, all the way until 1865, the process of emancipation was unfolding. And so we should think about, in this first step, emancipation and abolition as a process, right, rather than an event. That's step 1. If we think about it as a process rather than an event, that brings us to step 2, right? So the reason why so many activists and scholars have come to think about emancipation and abolition, not being complete, is because as soon as the slaves were freed, there was a process of trying to rebuild and reunify the country, and this was called Reconstruction. In 1930, the scholar, activist, intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois actually wrote about this moment in his book called Black Reconstruction, and came up with this term called abolition democracy, by which he meant the institutions, the new practices, the new ways of being with each other that would be necessary for slaves, for the formerly enslaved people, Black people to actually be free and thrive in the United States. And as we know, that 10-year period of attempting to do that was thwarted, it ended because of white resistance and because of political compromise by people who wanted to maintain or gain power. So abolition democracy and abolition in this moment was an exciting time of attempting to rethink US institutions, right? And that ended unsuccessfully. Step two. Step three, fast forward 100 or so years, right? And abolition begins to be applied to prisons and what the activist group Critical Resistance has called the prison industrial complex. And along with trying to abolish the prison industrial complex, the idea of abolition democracy then came to mean the sort of institutions and practices and ways of being with each other that would facilitate a transition away from prisons to something else, right? So you can see how these ideas keep traveling and applying to similar things, but shifting at the same time. And when we think about defund the police, the saying from the uprisings of last year, defund the police is in line with this tradition of thinking about abolition as it pertains to the prisons. Right? So from 1865 till now, the process of emancipation of Black people actually being able to live freely and thrive in the United States has been ongoing, and it remains so.
If we're thinking of 19th century, like abolition and the process of emancipation, is there anything that resonates with you in terms of today's movement for Black lives?
Absolutely, so much, too much to talk about right now in totality, but I'll name a few things that I think are important. And the first one is that think about post-revolutionary America, up to the Civil War. What we're really thinking about is the beginning of Black political thought and activism in the United States. And there's a straight line that you can draw from the sort of debates that were happening inside the Black community, but also outward towards the larger society back then to right now. And that doesn't mean that they're exactly the same. They're not. But the core foundation of these ideas start there. And so the movement for Black Lives, one of the innovations or shifts that they've brought about is a move away from what people call respectability politics or racial uplift, which is the idea that to be taken seriously in the world, you need to live and dress and talk and be a certain way, especially as a Black person. So back in the 19th century, the 18th and 19th century, this is when these ideas started to really take hold within the Black community. And it wasn't just to try to be accepted by white society, a racist white society. It was also about a kind of morality and virtue that Black people, independent of trying to appeal to white folks, wanted to do. And it wasn't just Black people, it was also a white people, it was a white society thing too. So in that sense, the idea of respectability politics is really a post-revolutionary, non-racialized idea that Black thinkers and activists then decided could be a strategy to gain greater access to equality, right? And so that idea traveled from that period all the way to the 21st century, where now the movement for Black lives would say something like all Black life, to recognize the fact that nobody is disposable. We love and protect all Black people, regardless of if they fit this narrow definition of what respectability should be.
I'm so happy you brought up this idea of respectability politics and just how in our current movement for Black lives, we really focus on this idea of all Black lives. You know, people often use the word intersectional in order to describe the movement for Black lives, you know, meaning the way a person's social and political identities can overlap and leave an individual vulnerable to multiple overlapping systems of discrimination like racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, transphobia, and etc. And so with that, I'm wondering if you can speak to how and why gender, especially, has been censored in the current movement for Black lives. And I'm wondering also if there's some people or historical figures that you know of that really embody this idea of intersectional activism that you think should be highlighted a bit more in public education today.
Great question. So when thinking about, as I just was saying before, the movement from respectability politics to rejecting respectability politics from the 19th century to the 21st century, that allows us to actually think about Black politics, not as always kind of repeating itself or turning back on itself, but proceeding over time in some kind of coherent fashion. And so in my work, I call that Black political development. So if we take this idea of Black political development and think about it in terms of intersectionality and how it ends up in the movement for Black lives, we can chart a similar course to the one that we did with respectability politics. So from the 19th century on, there is this gradual movement of widening the scope of who could do what within Black activism and Black thought. And alongside of that widening of who could do what, there's also a widening in society at large of people who had access to communication, independent of other people's control. And so if we think about this process, opening up our ideas about who can do what in our analysis of gender as it pertains to race, or race as it pertains to class, over time, the acceptance of certain formulations of these ideas and the ability to get them out in more expansive ways, whether it's through independent magazines or being able to, women being able to take on independent leadership roles. Those opportunities grew over time. So we get to the 60s where these forces are moving in a particular direction towards an opening up rather than a closing down. And then the radical shift in the 60s is that at that point, while thoughts about the interlocking aspects of hierarchical domination have been there before, it's only in the 60s, again with that movement, where Black women more self-consciously and assertively decided to articulate a theory of these things that people have been talking about for years. And they had the opportunity and the resources by the 60s to spread those ideas. And it's important to think about the many shifts that happened in the 60s, whether it's the gay liberation movement, and the larger feminist movement and Black power. These forces kind of converged together to produce a particular, in that moment, kind of articulation of intersectionality that traveled through the academy, that traveled through the widening opportunities for Black women authors, for example, like Toni Morris and Alice Walker, to really spread. And so that generation in the academy and the publication of those books, like Toni Morris and Alice Walker and Audre Lorde, Barbara Smith, for example, someone from Combahee River Collective who was in the academy, as was Angela Davis, right? So we see all these forces kind of setting the table and the stage for where we are now. And take it back to when I was talking before about abolition of prisons in the 90s, right? That comes out of the academy. The academy produced by the Academy of a generation that was produced out of the 60s. And it's that type of activism that kind of informed the early activism of people in the movement for Black lives. So as you can see, opportunities that unfold over time in the development of Black politics have widened the scope of not just who could participate, but what ideas would be centered. And because of the opening up in the 60s and the ability to get those ideas out more easily without having to get approval from someone on top, and the opening up because of the legislative victories of the 60s that allowed Black people and Black women in particular to go into more positions of power and privilege, like the Academy, set the table for the emergence of particular kind of politics in the movement for Black lives.
Yeah, that's really amazing to think about, just the timeline and the scope of how things have just transformed in order to inform us today about the movement for Black lives, and just the idea of naming ourselves, the idea of really having actual terms, solidified terms to describe what this movement is about. Well, that's really amazing. In the Museum of the City of New York, we have the Frederick A.O. Shorts Educational Department. And as we are constantly trying to create more programming and reach and transform our existing programming, for one, our Activist New York field trip that is based around our Activist New York exhibition. We part of it examines the move for Black Lives Today, and we try to focus on the concept of safety and the way it really encompasses many different definitions. And we really try to encourage students as well as teachers to think of the word safety in its many different forms in pertaining to how a person lives or how a person can survive in this world. So we really discussed a lot about Black Youth Project 100's actions, our streets, our bodies, our voices, and the importance of this question of what does safety mean to you? And I'm really curious if you can tell us more about the concept of safety as that really major thorough line in Black activism throughout history. And I'm also really curious about some of the different activist strategies that have been used to really ensure safety for all Black people, and that's really including like physical safety to ensuring equal access to healthcare. And I'm really curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I like about this series of questions and this conversation that we're having is that it keeps going back in a way, and this is important for people to understand, to the same thing, the development over time, right? So when we think about the concept of safety, first thing I think about, or that we should turn our attention to, is that same period in the 18th, 19th century, where mutual aid societies are being created to support the free Black populations largely in the As time goes on, still during slavery, other types of institutions and programs become vital. Right? Like after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, for example, in the mid-18th century, there was a creation of vigilance associations whose job was, in certain communities, to look out for potential slave catchers and hide the escaped slaves, so they couldn't. Sometimes this took place. The clashes between slave catchers and these vigilance societies would be violent. Right? So this is in the first instances when we can see Black people coming together in the name of safety, right? And so we can jump a couple of 20, 30 years, 40 years or so, and we get to initiatives like that of Ida B. Wells and the NAACP in the early years of the NAACP trying really, really hard to get out the word about lynching and to protect people from being lynched by making people understand that lynching was a thing that was actually happening on a national scale, similar to the ways abolitionists tried to garner sympathy for the cause of abolition by talking about how horrible it was, right? So this is a different form of safety, information, right? Sharing, trying to educate the public about something so they will then, turn the tide of public opinion towards eliminating that thing. Fast forward another 40 years, we have things like the Black Panthers breakfast program. So not just the armed patrols, but the breakfast programs. They had health clinics. They even had I forget what it's called, but they had an organization that they created on behalf of seniors, make sure seniors were safe. There's all of these different ways that, the Black Panther Party, was envisioning safety and performing it beyond, the famous example of the police patrols, right? And even beyond the breakfast program. So I think that this tradition has always been there in the Black community out of necessity, right? From, again, the mutual aid societies and vigilance committees to, Ida B. Wells and the NAACP to the Black Panther Party to the LP 100 and a larger movement for Black Lives.
Yeah, it's really incredible to think about. Because I believe that, when my work at the museum has especially informed me to this, really opening the scope of this idea of what does safety really means for Black people. Speaking personally, as a Black person myself living in this time, especially this past year and way beyond this past year, but witnessing so much different forms of racial injustice and violence done to Black and Brown people, in various forms of systems, in various systems of oppression. I personally find it really incredible how today I'm still able to see and to witness that people can still find a sense of creativity, of celebration and joy, and really and also to holster and to hold on to this idea of somebodiness. I've read a lot about Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, and what really resonates for me is this idea of having a sense of self-worth, or really having the quality of a person believing that they are someone who matters. And I feel like for Black people to hold on to that, especially during this time, is always been a really powerful thing. And so I'm curious to hear, how would you think of the importance of practicing this idea of self-care and healing in this current movement for Black lives and current Black activism? And I'm wondering if you could also name any examples of this being really present, being a central present idea in past activism and also in current activism too.
One of the things that has been amazing and new in the current movement for Black lives is this emphasis on healing. And to emphasize healing and to think about healing is to acknowledge trauma and harm, collective and individual. And so there's two things happening at once with that, right? It's wanting to create better practices that are away from the sort of disposability that is connected to prisons, right? This is an abolitionist movement, and we don't want to repeat the same sort of punishment paradigms that we've inherited. It starts with the sort of relationships and how we work through harm with each other. And so on one level, it's like rethinking that justice is in terms of resolving conflict. And that's part of just acknowledging this collective trauma and individual trauma that produces the sort of behaviors that cause harm. So there's the kind of collective care in that space. And then there's the individual care, the idea that if you can't, if you are not well with and in yourself, that is going to infect or play a part in disrupting the community. So taking care of oneself, whether it's in an activist community or in the workplace or in the school, classroom, being self-reflective of how you feel and taking the space. You know, we're rarely encouraged to take the space to work through things that might be affecting us, so that we don't allow those things to spill over to others. So the way these things have showed up in the movement have been in creating or trying to create new, brand new kind of institutions and frameworks through healing justice to adjudicate harm, to work through harm, but also to show, to model possibilities that don't currently exist. So this is that, that abolition democracy thing that we were talking about before. What we need to do to get to emancipation is come up with new ways of doing things, and healing justice, and bringing in other kinds of rituals to allow people to find ways to be more in touch with themselves. There's been lots of talking about ancestors and trying to create a sense of lineage, right? To Black people past, whether it's family members or others, to further ground one's sense of self, to further heal. And all of these things are new in terms of being central to and a core practice in Black movement, which isn't to say, obviously, there haven't been efforts to create a Black sense of self and self-worth before. As you mentioned, in the Black Power era, there was Black Power, Black is beautiful, all of that, right? In the early 20th century, there was the new Negro, right? And that was also meant as kind of an ushering in of a certain kind of Black self that one should embrace and be proud of, not just a Black self, but a collective self. W.E.B. Du Bois, who you mentioned earlier, was loved to talk about Negro spirituals and embracing those, and the kind of special genius, he would say, of Black folk culture, right? So that was another moment of again trying to create the language and the conditions for Black people to see themselves differently. That also happened in the early 18th and 19th century, specifically around the idea of being a citizen. And while that also kind of wound up creating this respectability politics that we were talking about that the movement rejected, it still was a moment where one reading of it is simply to say, you are worthy to practice your citizenship. You are worthy of having a good education. You are worthy of being able to have success. And you need to believe that to make it happen. So again, it goes all the way from the 19th century to now. So that idea is, but the specific language around it and the practices that are encompassing it are the things that have shifted over time.
I'm so happy that you explained it like that. Because this is one thing that, especially when teaching the Activist New York field trips, we always try to end it on that activity of like self-care, self-healing, really self-reflection. Because this is literally everyday work that all of us are trying to do. And so, as we think of really the past year of this really ever-growing, like really mass movements of activism has been really historic, but this is not the but this past year is not the first time that this has happened. Like, this is a ever growing project, I believe, of emancipation, and this work is definitely not done yet. We have had so much different activist movements which still needs to like continue on. The last thing I want to ask is, what do you think that we can do as a society, to complete this longer project of emancipation? And what would you imagine that to look like in your head?
I think about this question and have been asked this question before, and I always wind up coming back to the same spectrum of thought, which is we need to collectively move away from, first and foremost, an idea of completion. That this is where when we think about the idea of completion, we tend to construct really clear ideas about what things are supposed to look like. So we know we have been emancipated when this happens. But in reality, one of the creative possibilities of having a abolitionist democracy mindset is to have things that you collectively create and imagine together. So you can't prefigure it. It's a process that you do together. And so the process, the journey is the goal, rather than the construction, again, some already existing idea that will be clear to us, we'll recognize it when we get there. I think if we allow ourselves more room to accept that this is going to be ongoing and it may never be completed, and then let the project itself be what's important, and the values, the ethics that we bring to that project. So for me, I can't say what an emancipated future would look like because it doesn't exist. I can say that it's probably not going to look anything like the sort of institutions that we work through now. It's probably not going to look like the police, for example, because we know that the maintenance of those institutions are institutions like the police, as they are right now, aren't serving the project, not the end of emancipation, but the project, the ongoing process. And so I would invite everyone to, practice imagining otherwise, to allow yourself the space to have conversations with people in your community about what you actually would want if you could start over. If you could create your ideal world, what would that look like? Maybe even just in your community. And then ask yourself, okay, so if that's what I would like, if that's what would feel good, if that's what would make us safe, if that's what would help us thrive, how do we get from where we are now to there? And that's I think the only tangible way to think about an emancipated future, as a process that we imagine together.
And I think that is really the most beautiful note to end this. And I just want to thank you so much for being so generous and flexible with your time and for answering some of these questions. I know you've definitely opened my eyes, especially to a lot of different possibilities and a lot of different things that I need to look into within myself and into the past in order to, like I said before, I feel like in order to understand this present, we always have to go to the past. And thank you so much for joining me today on this. And I just want to plug your book just one more time because I am excited to read it. Your first book, To Build a Black Future, Blackness and Social Movement in the Time of Black Lives Matter. And with that, I cannot wait to read your book. And I want to thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been
it's been really great. I appreciate it. And for anyone watching, also to visit our exhibition, Activist New York, at the Museum of the State of New York. And you can also visit the online exhibition at activistnewyork.mcny.org. And thank you for all for tuning in, for joining us. Thank you, Chris, for your time and your incredible work. I cannot wait to see all the things that you have to do for the future.
Thank you.
Great.